These lectures are meant to give you an overview or like a survey of the human neuroanatomy as it will pertain to the rest of the course. Keep it in mind that there are many, many things that we will not be able to cover, but it'll give you an overview of the types of concepts and structures and associated types of complexes that might be needed for you in the rest of the chapters. There's some online access materials for you that we'll be using both this week and next week, both in your textbook as in the form of flashcards. There's also some great coloring pages, some references that you can use, some short videos that you can access to look at in addition to the ones that I've put together. Again, this is not meant to be exhaustive, and for some of you this may be more review, but I would increasingly tell you that this review would be something that you might want to have available to you. So the first thing that we have to look at are the general types of neuroanatomical names for directions. And so the axes and the types of things that we're going to see in future weeks, there is a sheet online for you guys to look at further information about how these work. And you can look at that one. There's a sheet that shows you what different cross sections would look like. And you can see these on the right here. On the right, we could talk a little bit about the horizontal axis, the sagittal axis, and you'll hear more about that in a couple of minutes here, and then the coronal or frontal axis. Keep it in mind, like a coronal or frontal axis is kind of like cutting your nose off your face, and the sagittal axis is kind of like sawing you right in half down the middle. If it's a mid-sagittal, then that would be right down the middle, and if it's off to either side, then that's called parasagittal. And then this idea of horizontal axis is if we take cross sections from like the feet up towards the head. Now, each of these gives you a very distinct structure. So as we look at internal structures of both the spinal cord and the brain or other parts of the nervous system, these structures will have reference based on the kind. So if you were to do an MRI or PET scan, you can see that these different types of planes will give you a great deal of information, and they will look at very different things. So you might see different types of planes. Now, the second thing that you should note is that we're going to be using references to the types of things that you might see in the brain or the spinal cord with direction terms. So if it's in the brain, you'll notice that things that are towards the nose are more rostral, towards the front of the head, caudals towards the back. This is different than in the spinal cord and the rest of the body, where it's ventral and dorsal, right, front and back. It's also important to note that we can talk about inferior posterior, right? And so the idea that anterior is in front, posterior is behind, superior is above, and inferior is below. So we'll be using a lot of these directional terms that are often used in anatomy. Throughout the text, you'll see this kind of intermittently. So this is a good reference slide to come back to. It's also important to look again online because I have some great reference material for you there as well. So let's start by looking at the central nervous system. We've talked about this prior. If you look on the left side here, you're going to see there are divisions of the spinal cord and the brain. The brain and spinal cord together come and form the central nervous system. Anything that branches off of them, like spinal nerves, cranial nerves, or any peripheral nerves, are part of the peripheral nervous system. We'll come back to that again later on. There are 7 major parts that we have located here on the right that are part of the central nervous system: the cerebrum, and you've heard about this as the cerebral cortex, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, the diencephalon, the pons, and the medulla. We'll spend a little time as we move through this lecture kind of going over each of those a little bit more. You'll see that the spinal cord has basically pairs of spinal nerves that emanate from each side out of the vertebral column, which is the spinal cord, and the vertebrae. And you can see that there are C1 through 8 are those cervical nerves. There's a pair of each of those. The thoracic nerves, right, which are going to be T1 through T12, are the lumbar nerves, which are then L1 through L5. And note that right around L2 here is corresponding to a region called the lumbosacral enlargement. This is about where the vertebrae stop. Everything else emanates beyond the vertebrae, and so they're not as protective as other regions of the spinal cord. And it's also important to note that we have sacral and coccygeal nerves towards the bottom portion here, and these will become very important when we talk about some parts of the autonomic nervous system a little bit later on. It's important to note that when we look at these pairs of nerves, that they are emanating towards structures within the body. So they innervate all the incoming and outgoing information, the incoming sensory and the outgoing motor functions from the spinal cord. And if damage is made to the spinal cord, it's sort of the regions that are damaged, it's everything that is posterior to that that would be affected. And we'll come back to these kinds of damages later on. This is looking at the cerebral hemisphere and the four major lobes of the brain. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about function of these lobes, and we'll dive into this deeper each week. The idea is that the frontal lobe is clearly in the front, and there's a structure in the brain called the central sulcus. These are like valleys that are found deep inside of the brain. The gyri are the sort of like, I would call them mountains, or the sort of, and this invagination is a central sulcus, and it's very important because it separates that frontal lobe from the parietal lobes. And then you can see the occipital lobe in the back, and then the temporal lobe over the ears, right around the ears. And there is a structure on the lateral portions that separate the frontal and temporal lobe called the lateral fissure. If you look at the brain and the brain structure, these fissures and sulci play a very important role. Fissure is just a deeper sulcus, basically. And we will talk a little bit more about this a little later on, because if you separate through the lateral fissure here, you'll find what is called sometimes the fifth major lobe, which is the insula. We'll talk more about that. There are a number of other sulci and gyri, but again, the major ones that you need to know are the central sulcus, which we'll talk about a little bit later on when we talk about motor function and sensory function in the brain. And we'll also talk a little bit about the lateral and sylvian fissure when we talk a little bit more about reading and auditory cues in the brain. It's also important to note that on some of the materials that I've placed online for you, there's a great project for you to do, which is to print out a color version of a sheet called the Anatomy and Functional Brain Areas of the, or Functional Areas of the Brain. And it tells you in sort of a colored version, you should print this out in color, all the different major structures in the brain, including that insula we talked to that was deep underneath that lateral sulcus or fissure. And you can see that the frontal lobes are typically involved in many things, including motivation, how we plan things, aggression, your sense of smell, and your mood, and some of the voluntary motor functions as well. And I'll talk to you a great deal of length about this. The parietal lobes are more important for our sensory functions. They receive information from the sort of ascending cues from touch, pain, temperature, balance, and taste. Our occipital lobes are going to be important for our visual center. We'll spend a lot of time looking at that one because it's very well worked out. And then we'll talk about the temporal lobes being important for smell and primary hearing inputs, and for some of your memory, abstract thought, and judgment. Keep in mind, these are the primary lobes, and there will be associated structures or association cortices that we'll talk about located around these regions as well. So let's talk here a little bit more about the structure of the spinal cord. And it's important to note here, when you look at the structure, you can see that there are dorsal roots and ventral roots. And the dorsal roots are the incoming sensory information that's coming into the spinal cord. And the ventral roots are going to be the part that have the outgoing motor function. It's also important to note, we talked a little bit about these ganglia. The ganglia, we have a pre-ganglionic neuron and we have a post-ganglionic neuron, very important in the autonomic nervous system. We'll spend a lot of time on the parasympathetic and sympathetic system. But keep in mind that that dorsal root, we'll see in the next slide, these dorsal and ventral roots are really that incoming sensory information and the outgoing motor function. And the spinal cord really does play that role in what's coming in from our sensory information, feeding it up to the brain and giving us a motor function as a outgoing function back to muscles and glands and other innervated sources. It's also important to note that the spinal cord itself and the brain are covered by layers called the meninges. We'll come back to that a little bit later on in this lecture. There is gray and white matter in the spinal cord, very important to note. We'll come back to that on the next slide. And also, if you look at the structure of the spinal cord, it's encased in a series of vertebrae. each of these bone structures have tiny little openings in them that allow for the combination of the dorsal and ventral roots, which come together to form your spinal nerves in this way. And each one of them each one of these vertebrae has a little structure here in blue. This is basically a fibrocartilage, and it's a disc that you've heard about slip discs probably before, that prevents sort of damage from the spinal cord. They give it a little bit of a cushion, and over time these might slip or damage. And what happens is these bones come together now, and they impinge upon the spinal nerves here, and that can create problems with sensory and motor function of different regions of the body. It's also important to note that we're going to talk about ascending and descending tracts coming up. We'll look at these a little bit more intensely next week in motor function. This is looking at the internal structure of the spinal cord. Fascinating structures, right? So the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral region all have this inner gray matter and the outer white matter. We'll talk about ascending tracts in the white matter, and then also we'll talk about the structures that are located in the gray matter that sort of tie into these different patterns. So the white matter has these columns, we'll call them, or funiculi, and they are literally ascending columns that go to the brain with information from all the sensory incoming information from the dorsal root ganglia. And then we have these fascicular pathways that we'll talk about, the very specific ones. Each one of them carries different types of information, pain or temperature, or whether you have derma function, right? So some sort of sensory function in your skin. And we'll also see descending tracts as well in these paths that'll play a role. Keep in mind that white matter means that things move faster, and the gray matter things move slower. Also, we'll note that these structures, the gray matter, actually form horns. So these are typically called the dorsal horn, the ventral horn, and the lateral horn off to the side here. This shows you a little bit more information about the dorsal, ventral, and lateral horns. Keep in mind the dorsal horn is our sensory information. Our ventral horn is going to contain all of our motor neurons. And our lateral horn is where all of our autonomic motor neurons actually handle information. You can see some of these ascending tracts, descending tracts. Again, we'll get into these columns and tracts in upcoming weeks. It's also important to note that the structures of the spinal cord are separated by these sort of commissures. There are divisions here. You can see like little openings of sorts. And these play very important roles in helping us separate sort of the symmetrical sides, that left and right side of the spinal cord, which serve different portions of the body and then ultimately send information to different portions of the brain. This last slide kind of shows you a little bit more about this idea, the sensory incoming information, right, into the dorsal root. And then they can either they go up to the brain then. There's a lot more information that you'll see in the book about all the different subregions within these different sensory and motor regions. The lateral region here, the lateral column, is all the outgoing autonomic nervous system motor functions, neurons. And then the ventral horn here is all the somatic motors. So the typical sort of red muscles, those skeletal muscles, are innervated by these muscles. We'll spend a lot of time looking a little bit more in detail about all these different regions, sort of breaking them down into smaller details in upcoming chapters, especially when we start talking about pain.